Question number 30, ANOUK. ANOUK is a public limited entity which, with a reporting date of 31st of December 2011, it has covenants attached to some of the bank loan balances included within liabilities on the statement of financial position. The covenant creates a legal obligation to repay the loans in full if announced liabilities exceed a specific level. A new financial controller was appointed in January 12 and has discovered some financial reporting issues in the relation to the year ended 31st of December 11. देखते हैं अपने को क्या करना है. ओ ओके 18 और 2 मतलब 20 मार्क के लिए एक ही क्वेश्चन है. डिस्कस द अकाउंटिंग एंड एथिकल इम्प्लीकेशंस ऑफ द अबाव. ओके, तो एक एक करके बताते रहते हैं अभी. सो फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल ऐसा चालू करते हैं कि एनॉक इज अ पब्लिक लिमिटेड एंटिटी विद रिपोर्टिंग डेट ऑफ 31st ऑफ December 11. ANOUK had certain had taken out certain bank loans which were included in the liabilities. However, these bank loans were attached had certain covenants in them. If these covenants were breached, then then there would be a legal obligation created wherein the liabilities would have to be paid off immediately. Thus, we can say that there can be thus there is a there are chances that the management would have tried to manipulate the financial statements in such a way that the covenants are maintained, so that bank loan doesn't get repayable immediately. This can be hinted out by looking in the first scenario, receivables factoring. On 1st of December 2011, ANOUK sold some of its trade receivables to a debt factor. The factor advanced 20% of the 40 million receivables sold. Okay, एडवांस फैक्टर ने हमको 20% दे दिया. Further amounts payable to ANOUK but are subject to an imputed interest charge, so that ANOUK receives progressively less of the remaining balance the longer it takes the factor to recover the funds. The factor has full recourse to ANOUK for a 6 month period, after which ANOUK has no further obligations and has no rights to receive any further payments from the factor. The directors are concerned about the negative impact that any potential debt factoring arrangements may have on its loan covenants. As such, they have ordered the financial controller to treat the factoring arrangement in accordance with this legal form. So, here we can see that the factor has full recourse option. That means if the funds are not recovered by the factor, then entire receivable will be given back to ANOUK company. Thus, no further payments would be received, and the advance which was given to ANOUK would also be payable back to the factor immediately. Thus the 20% of the 40 million receivables sold should not be recorded as a revenue, but rather should be recorded on the liability side. Thus, when the 20% of the 40 million is recorded on the liability side, there are chances that the liabilities would increase, and because of which the covenants might get breached. Thus, the directors, uh, thus this might have a negative impact on the potential debt fact on the loan covenants. ये अपन बता सकते हैं. Hmm. And then अपन actually चालू ऐसे कर सकते हैं. Factoring is a service wherein the receivables of a company are being given to another factor company which collects the receivables on their behalf. This can take two forms. First is with recourse and current second is without recourse. In the one where there is without recourse, the entire amount is paid to ANOUK and the receivables will not be brought back to ANOUK company. Thus the receivables can be derecognized. However, in the current scenario, it is with recourse and thus the receivables cannot be derecognized, and the advance which has been received would be treated as a liability or a deferred liability मैं बोलना चाहता हूँ. हाँ, deferred liability मैं बोल सकता हूँ. आगे B shares. One of ANOUK's subsidiaries, Vinna, has two classes of shares, A and B. A shares carry voting powers, and B shares are issued to meet regulatory requirements. Vinna shareholders agreement stipulates that minority B holders can exercise the put option every 3 years, which requires ANOUK to buy their shares. The exercise price is the original cost paid by the shareholders. In ANOUK's consolidated statement of financial position, the B shares owned by minority shareholders are reported in equity as non-controlling interest. ट्रेन का तो बाद में आता है, पहले इसी का आता है. Hmm. According to IFRS 9 financial instruments, put options are options which एक मिनट when an entity requires to buy back its own shares at a given future date, then they are recorded as a financial liability. बराबर है. However, in the current scenario, we can see that B shareholders can exercise a put option every 3 years, which requires ANOUK to buy back share. वो सब तो अपन कॉपी पेस्ट करेंगे इसके पहले वाले लाइन में. Here we can see that in ANOUK's consolidated financial statement of financial position, the B shares owned by minority shareholders are reported in equity as a non-controlling interest. This is not a fair representation, as a representation should have been financial liability. This this can be an error of error by the management or the team. However, such an error uh, would decrease the debt. Would नहीं, एक मिनट. Such an error would affect the covenants or would affect the breach of covenants, because of which the covenant would not get breached, and which can also indicate that this there are higher chances of manipulation of financial statements being taken place. The financial controller should discuss the accounting treatment with the directors, and should record the B shares as financial liability rather than a non-controlling interest in the equity. ये अपन बता देंगे. Crane. On 31st of December 11, ANOUK signed a contract to use a crane for next 5 years. The supplier of the crane is permitted to substitute the crane for an alternative model during the period of use. It is required to do so if crane develops a fault. Due to the size of the crane, the supplier would have to incur significant cost to substitute it. The contract states that ANOUK can use the crane for any construction activities it wishes. However, contract also said that the crane cannot be used if wind speed exceeds the 14 meters per second. ANOUK must pay a fixed monthly rental fee for use of the crane. ANOUK has posted no accounting entries in respect of the contract. The financial controller found this contract by accident and suspects that the data are attempting to conceal it. When the financial director found the contract by accident, he thought that the directors were attempting to conceal it. This is a very logical reasoning, or this is a very logical suspicion on the directors, because the current scenario wherein ANOUK signed a contract to use the crane for the next 5 years is a lease agreement in accordance and should be accounted for in accordance with IS 16 leases. Here in this scenario the supplier of the crane is permitted to substitute. अभी वो उस चीज के ऊपर ना आप एक्चुअली बाद में आते हैं, पर सबसे पहले बता देते कि लीज एग्रीमेंट होता क्या है. इन अ लीज एग्रीमेंट द राइट ऑफ यूज ऑफ एन एसेट इज passed on, or the control of use of the asset has been passed on to the lessee for the intended use. The lessee accounts for the right of use asset and by recognizing a right of use asset on the debit side of the, or as an asset in the statement of financial position, and recognizes a lease liability on the liability side. Thus, by recognizing a lease liability, the liability, the total liabilities increases, and this can also have a breach on the overall contract. But first, we have to identify whether the contract identifies as a lease or not. Um, uh, हाँ, देर आर सर्टेन रिस्ट्रिक्शंस ऑन द यूज ऑफ द एक्टिविटी. पहले बात तो मैं ऐसा बताएंगे कि द कॉन्ट्रैक्ट एनओ कैन यूज द क्रेन फॉर any construction activities it wishes. Thus, ANOUK has control of the asset. However, there are certain restrictions on the use of the asset, such as the contract states that ANOUK can use the crane, uh, cannot use the crane if the wind speed exceeds 14 meters per second. This restrictions does not affect the direct control that ANOC has, but is just a small restriction on the asset. Thus, the lease agreement still stands. There can be suspicion upon whether this contract is a lease or not when एक्चुअली इसको ऐसे लिखने से अच्छा वी कैन राइट इन दिस वे कि इफ द सप्लायर ऑफ द एसेट the supplier of the asset substitutes the asset for another asset and then gains significant economic benefits out of it, then this contract cannot be called as a lease. However, in the current scenario also, the supplier of the crane is permitted to substitute the crane for an alternative model during the period of use if there are any faults being seen in the crane. The supplier would not, and it has also been stated that the supplier would have to incur significant costs to substitute it. Thus, he is not gaining any economic benefits out of it. Thus, the contract is still a lease liability, and because it is a lease liability, the total liabilities increases, because of which the debt covenants might get breached, or the covenants will be breached. Um, Bank loans influence liability obligation. अभी और क्या है? हम्म, in the case of ANOC subsidiaries Vina, where it has A and B shares, the B shares were accounted in a wrong way, wherein they were reported on the equity side as a non-controlling interest. This could have been an accounting mistake made by the company's accountants or directors. However, in the current scenario of Crane, the directors did not even account for this transaction, and thus this creates high suspicion on the integrity and objectivity of the directors regarding their towards investors. This is because the directors have an ethical responsibility to present the financial statements in a much better way, or in an appropriate manner, with a faithful representation to the investors. Thus, they are not doing their job accurately because they are trying to manipulate the financial statements by not recognizing the crane's contract at all. उसके बाद the financial controller should discuss the accounting repercussions and should remind the directors of their ethical responsibilities. If the directors are still not agreeing on the accounting treatments suggested by the financial controller, then financial controller should seek help from the ACCA helpline. And still, if the issues are not resolved, then he should consider resignation from the company as a whole, और resignation from the company. इतना ही लिखेंगे तो भी चलेगा. एक बार चेक कर लेते हैं मैंने क्या क्या बोला है. देखो, receivables. IFRS 9 financial instruments suggest that receivables should be derecognized from the financial statements when the following conditions are met. there is no further rights to receive cash. The risk and rewards of ownership have substantially transferred. अभी देखो, the factor has full recourse for 6 month period, so ANOUK still has the irrecoverable debt risk. तो मतलब इसलिए मैंने बोला था कि अपन रिसीवेबल को नहीं हटा सकते. Furthermore, ANOUK has the right to receive further cash payments from the factor. ANOUK has the right to receive further cash payments from the factor, the amount to be received being dependent on when and if the customers pay the factor. ANOUK still has the risk associated with slow payment by the customers. As such, the receivables must not be derecognized from the financial statements on the 31st of December 2011. Instead, the proceeds of 8 million should be treated as short-term liability. मैंने उसको शायद deferred liability बोला था, but they have named it short-term liability. Short-term liability ही मतलब ये अपन लिखेंगे. Accounting for legal form of the transaction will understate the receivables and understate the liabilities. This makes it less likely that ANOUK will break its loan covenants. अच्छा, मेरे को ये आंसर बहुत ही छोटा लग रहा था, इसलिए मैंने फैक्टरिंग क्या होता है वो भी पहले बता दिया था. इन्होंने बोला कि वो मतलब बताने की जरूरत शायद नहीं है यहाँ पे ऐसा. उन्होंने आंसर काफी कंसाइज ही रखा है, काफी छोटा ही रखा है एक्चुअली. ये बस बीच में बॉक्स है इसलिए थोड़ा बड़ा दिख रहा है. Debt or equity, IS 32 financial instruments presentation uses principles-based definitions of a financial liability, which is debt, and of equity. The key feature of debt is that issuer is obliged to deliver either cash or another financial asset to the holder. The contractual obligation may arise from a requirement to repay principal and interest or dividends. एक्चुअली अपन ने लायबिलिटी और इक्विटी क्या होता है वो बता देते तो भी और आंसर और मतलब बड़ा बन जाता. The contractual obligation में वो बता देगा ना. हाँ, equity is an contract which evidences a residual interest in the entity's assets after deducting all the liabilities. तो again उन्होंने बता दिया equity क्या होता है, पहले बता दिया liability क्या होता है. A financial instrument is normally an equity instrument if the instrument includes no contractual obligation to deliver cash or another financial asset to another entity, such as ordinary shares. ANOUK's decision to classify B shares as non-controlling interest is incorrect. ANOUK has clear contractual obligation to buy B shares from the non-controlling interest under agreed terms and does not have an unconditional right to avoid delivering cash to settle the obligation. And the minority shareholders B should therefore be treated as a financial liability in the consolidated financial statements. जैसा अपन ने बोला था, the current treatment of the B shares overstates ANOUK's equity and understates its liabilities. This makes it less likely that ANOUK will break its loan covenants. फिर आता है क्रेन कॉन्ट्रैक्ट. IFRS 16 leases says that the contract contains a lease if it contains the right to control the use of an identified asset for a period of time in exchange for consideration. तो ये अपने को बताना था कि लीजेस होता क्या है. उसके बाद to have a control, the contract must give the customer the right throughout the period of use substantially all the identified assets and economic benefits and direct the identified assets use. Although the crane used by ANOUK can be substituted, the supplier is unlikely to benefit from this due to the costs involved. Therefore, it can be concluded that ANOUK has the right to use an identified asset over the contract term. इसलिए अपने को इसको एज अ क्या बोलते हैं, जूम इन कर लेता हूँ. इसलिए वी हैव टू ट्रीट दिस एज अ लीज बिकॉज इससे उसको कुछ बेनिफिट नहीं हो रहा है. ANOUK has the right to direct the use of the crane because it decides how the crane will be used. The restriction on operating during high winds is outlined in the contract, define the scope of ANOUK's use rather than preventing ANOUK from directing use. Therefore, ANOUK controls the crane over the period of use. Based on above discussion, it would seem that the contract contains a lease. A lease liability should have been recognized at the commencement of the lease for the present value of the payments to be made. A right of use should be recognized for the same value plus any associated direct cost. And now has posted no accounting entries and so is currently understating its assets and liabilities. Once again, it makes it less likely that the loan covenants will be breached. Let's like ethics. It is important that stakeholders of the company can rely on financial statements to make informed and accurate decisions. The directors of ANOUK have an ethical responsibility to produce financial statements which comply with accounting standards, ट्रांसपेरेंट एंड फ्री फ्रॉम एरर फ्रॉम मटेरियल। तो ये अपन ने बताया था कि स्टेक होल्डर की डायरेक्टर्स आर रिस्पॉन्सिबल कि वो इन्वेस्टर्स को सारे ये इंफॉर्मेशन दे, फ्री फ्रॉम एरर, फेथफुली रिप्रेजेंट करके ये सब। The current accounting treatment of all three transactions understates and now reported liabilities. The current accounting treatments, if uncorrected, may mislead and now stakeholders. Any adverse publicity could lead to loss of public trust in the accounting profession. Wait, मेरा ज़्यादा ध्यान नहीं था ये पढ़ते टाइम। The current accounting treatment of all three transaction understates reported हाँ understate करता है सारे के सारे liabilities को बराबर। The current accounting treatment if uncorrected may mislead announced stakeholders, okay मतलब उनको mislead करेगा। Any adverse publicity would lead to a loss of public trust in the accounting profession. It would seem likely that the directors are deliberately circumventing the terms of the covenants, particularly as they have concealed documents from the financial controller. Such actions are clear breach of fundamental principles of objectivity and integrity as outlined in the ACCA Code of Ethics and Conduct. The financial controller should remind the directors of their ethical responsibilities and remind the announced financial statements must fully comply with the accounting standards. Records of these discussions should be kept. If disagreements remain, the financial controller should seek advice from ACCA. The financial controller may need to consider resignation if no effective channel of internal reporting, if concerns exist. For internal reporting of concern exists. जैसा अपन ने बताया था, एंडिंग तो अपना सेम ही रहेगा जो अपन बाकी सारे एथिक्स के आंसर में डालते हैं वही रहेगा। ठीक है, थैंक यू, बाय।